right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks to you both for inviting me again. Okay. I have nothing to disclose. I do have a disclosure to make, which is that I am in no way an expert on the theory of learning. Dr. Mellinger was kind enough to provide me this really great book by Peter Brown about the science of successful learning. So I'm going to try my best to explain some basic concepts of learning to you, and then finish up the talk by giving you some tips on how you could use that in your everyday practice. So there are some basic facts about learning that we all should be aware of. So first of all, in order to learn, you have to have memory. So you can't learn anything new unless you can base it on prior knowledge that you already have. So it's important, of course, to have memory. Second thing is that learning occurs throughout your life, and as you're going through your life, you acquire new skills, you master those skills, and those skills that you're mastering all basically apply onto your prior knowledge. And it's a lifelong thing, and it's not easy. I would say that most of the skills that people use to try to learn are difficult. They feel counterproductive, and so therefore people try to use skills that are easier to them, although those skills don't end up being the most productive for them. So I think the most important thing to know about learning is that to have durable learning, you have to put a lot of effort into it. It has to be very effortful. And the bad news is that most of us don't even necessarily know when we're doing well at something or not doing well at something. And so this is what we're going to go over, some strategies on how to think about that. But like I said, the most important thing you need to know is that if you're trying to learn and it seems really easy, that's probably not the best way to learn that topic. Probably one of the two most used learning strategies are called either rereading or mass practice. And I would say probably everyone in this room has used one form of that. So rereading is just basically, like for example, you're cramming for an exam and you sit down the day before and you just go over and over and reread all the text. Turns out that doesn't work very well. It's not very durable at all. Mass practice is doing sort of massed constant repetition of something in an effort to get it to stick in your memory. The best example for that would be if you're practicing a piano piece and you're just memorizing the fingering for your piano piece rather than actually learning how to read the music and play the notes. So again, those two things are not durable ways to learn and have that be durable, but it ends up feeling easiest for all of us, and so that's why it's probably the most commonly used strategies. Best way to really think about making your learning more durable is to do what's called retrieval practice. So retrieval practice is to try to use effort to get some concept out of your memory and bring it to your forefront. So basically, if you do that, your brain has neural pathways. Those neural pathways can get almost like a muscle. It gets strengthened by doing this, and that makes your learning much more practiced and more effortful. So I guess two techniques that I would say are probably common that some of you have used would be, for example, flashcards, right? So you've learned some material, and then instead of just rereading it, you now use flashcards to see if you can actually retrieve those, what you've just learned from your memory. Another thing would be to do some sort of a quiz after you've learned some material. So you've learned material, then you take a quiz on the material. You see if that quiz actually makes you have to retrieve that knowledge out of your brain, and that can actually be more durable. I would say a good example for that is like using a CSAP to study for your boards. There's a few concepts which seem very counterintuitive. When I read about them, it seemed really weird. So those are called either spacing or interleaving. Those are concepts that are used to, again, make retrieval of your memory harder. But again, in the long term, it produces much more lasting results. So for example, if you're trying to think about something and then you take time between when you've learned it and when you go back to learn it, what happens is when you go back to retrieve that out of your memory, that is more effortful, and that creates more durable learning. Your body, it turns out your mind needs some time to take something you've learned and consolidate it into your memory. So it takes a little bit of time for that to happen. So if you give your brain some time for that to happen, when you go back to retrieve it, it's a little bit harder, but it makes it stick. I'll give you some example of spacing out practices is instead of just trying to learn everything sort of in one, session, you can actually take it out. So there was a study on some neurosurgery residents. They were trying to teach the neurosurgery residents a technique for microsurgery. So instead of what they used to do, which is have all the neurosurgery residents sit down, learn like the 4 techniques like in one afternoon, and then hope that they're going to learn it durably, they would actually take those neurosurgery residents, space them out. So they've learned one task 1 week, then they'd come back a week later, then have to go back and think about the first week again, learn the new task, so forth. That turns out that works out much better. Interleaving is similar, but it's a little bit different. So you basically teach something not in sequence. So again, great example is, let's say you're trying to learn math. So the way you typically learn math is like, for example, my kids, they go in, they learn chapter 1, they learn all about chapter 1, they take a bunch of homework on chapter 1, and they go to chapter 2, learn all about chapter 2, take the homework on chapter 2, then they get a test at the end of the semester, and turns out you don't get all the questions in the same order, right? They're all mixed up, and you have to sort of think, oh, which equation do I need to use, or how do I do that? So instead of doing your teaching like that, it might be better to actually interleave and learn chapter 1 for a little while, then go to chapter 4, then go to chapter 2. Again, if that's really hard, people don't want to do that, but it turns out that you actually do way better on tests and durable learning if you do it that way. So there are some just basic foundations of knowledge that I think we should all think about. So if you try to solve a problem rather than just being taught that solution, you're going to do much better. Again, an example I would use is, let's say you have a trainee, a med student, or a resident in clinic with you. They go see a patient. They come back. If you have them present the patient to you, think it all out themselves, come up with a solution on what they think is wrong with the patient and what needs to be done with the patient, that's going to be way better for that trainee than you just saying, okay, this is what I think this patient has, this is what I think we should do, and this is why I think that. Those are 2 different strategies, but the first strategy is going to be much more effective. And again, for learners, if you think your preferred style of learning, for example, let's say you think you're an auditory learner or a visual learner, you should always try to use multiple other kinds of learning strategies to make your learning better. As I mentioned before, all learning requires that foundation of prior knowledge. So, you're not going to go and try to do a complicated redo paraesophageal hernia repair unless you can do a nice straightforward one first. But again, when we think about learning, you have to remember that we are, in general, poor judges of what we do know, and we really should constantly use some sort of testing mechanism for ourselves to continue to build mastery so that we can see what we're not actually that good at. Other techniques are elaboration, where, again, if you think about a problem and you can actually express it in your own words and actually even put it in context with some other things that you may already know, you're going to be able to think about that, and that's going to be able to be incorporated into your mind much better. Other thing is to think about topics in a greater context is, again, something you're familiar with. So if I'm explaining, for example, a bowel obstruction to somebody like a patient or a med student, I use the example of watering your grass. I said, well, there's a hose and there's a kink in the hose. Everything before where the kink is gets all stretched out, and eventually if there's too much pressure, it can rupture. I mean, that's like a sort of a way that it puts it in context with something that the person already knows, and it makes it easier for them to understand that. So we'll end up on a few practical tips. So I just gave you some strategies on how to think about learning and keeping that learning more durable. But some practical tips like, where should you learn? Where should you work? Again, I think this is all very dependent on the person. For me, for example, I am incredibly focused first thing in the morning. So if I know I have to get something done or I want to learn something, I will get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'll come into my office from 4:30 to 7:30. No one's paging me, no one's texting me, it's pretty quiet, there's no one in the hospital. I can get my entire day's work done during that period of time, as opposed to, let's say, I find out, oh, a case just canceled and I have a whole afternoon free. Turns out if I try to work in that afternoon that's free, I get nothing done. So I would urge everyone to think to yourself, when is the time that is most effective for me, and make intentional effort to set aside that time, to use that time for when you want to do learning or get your work done or get your paper done. Also, who to learn from. I would say, there's some technological tips that we all use to try to get learning done in our very busy schedules. But I also urge you to think about people that you work with that could maybe help you learn something new. As I said, you always should be learning new strategies as you go through life. So, for example, when I moved to Wisconsin 6 years ago, I really only did inguinal hernias open or TEP. And, two of my partners do TAPs all the time. So I scrubbed with one of them to see how they did TAPs. And then I forced myself to do a bunch of TAPs in a row, even though it's so much easier for me to do a TAP. But now I can do a TEP, I can do a TAP, and I can do open. And if I get a complicated patient that might need one of those options, I'm adept at any of those, and I can use the one that's best for the patient. So again, it was very hard for me and very difficult for me to learn a new technique that when I knew there was something that was easier, but again, if it's not effortful, it's not gonna work. And then, I would just say some other practical tips. So again, we're all busy, we've got lots of stuff going on clinically, busy family lives, all that stuff. What can we use to try to make our lives a little bit easier? So I would urge you all, if you work with someplace that has a librarian, like for example, I went down to the librarian, I had her set up a search for me for some specific topics that I'm particularly interested in. She puts up sets up an automated search. So once a month, anything that's been published recently on that specific topic pops up in my email, and then again, I don't have to spend a lot of time like reading through a bunch of different journals. I get them sent right to my email, like, oh, that's interesting. Let me read about that. That's not interesting. So if you guys haven't tried that before, I would strongly urge you to do that. It works really great. Obviously we've all get journal updates. If you can subscribe to whichever journal is most applicable to your field, and that's a great way for you to get some information like sent directly to you, so you don't have to spend a lot of time looking for the specific topics that are of interest to you. And then, of course, obviously, I am just signed up for Twitter because my partners, which is right, one of them is right there, just made fun of me. But I will say that now that I have it, you can, mold it so that what it pulls up for you is something that's relevant for you and that's going to be helpful for you. And again, this is a way to just save a little time so that when you do have a few minutes, you can, learn something new, not spend a lot of extra effort doing that. And I think that's it as far as just final conclusions. Again, learning is hard, but if you don't take the effort to do that, it's not going to be durable and you're going to be really wasting your time. It all, of course, builds on your prior knowledge, as I talked about, ongoing learning throughout your life, and again, try to be very intentional in how and what you're learning. Thanks very much.